Welcome everyone to Thales College. If you haven't been here before, my name is Peter Farris. I'm the provost. And welcome to our third and final lecture in this year's Sidney and Cecile Smith Lectures on Virtue. I want to begin by saying a special thank you to the founder of Thales College, Mr. Robert Luddy, and to Miss Christine Smith, whose generous donation in honor of her parents, Sidney and Cecile, has made this lecture series possible. It is my pleasure to welcome our lecturer this evening, Dr. Matthew Mehan, Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Government at the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College. The Thales College faculty and I had the distinct pleasure of having dinner with Dr. Mehan last night, and as we were enjoying getting to know each other, I was struck by the thought, here is a man truly deserving of the description, Ciceronian. Now, that's not probably a word that we use nowadays, but to the degree that it's used, I believe it meant to mean a particular style of writing or speaking. I don't mean it that way. I think he's Ciceronian in at least two other ways. First, like the great Roman statesman, lawyer, orator, writer, moralist, and philosopher, who will be the subject of our lecture tonight, Dr. Mehan's talents and accomplishments are prodigious. He is, among other things, a veteran classical school teacher and mentor to other teachers, a classical school planter. I didn't even know that was a thing. I heard of church planters. He's planted many schools. An expert in the literature on educating leading citizens, especially the writings of Cicero, Seneca, Shakespeare, and Thomas More. One of the principal architects of Hillsdale's Graduate School in Government in Washington, D.C., and a professor there teaching humanities and government courses to both undergraduates and graduate students. A successful children's book author, a devoted husband, the father of 8 children, a teller of amusing after-dinner tales, an enthusiastic amateur geographer, and, I have it on good authority, a formidable rugby player. Second, I think it is fair to say that he is not simply a scholar, but also an ardent disciple, or maybe, I don't know, maybe disciple's too strong a word, but an ardent admirer, anyway, of Cicero's teachings, and has deeply internalized his teacher's acute moral sensibility. For example, last night at dinner, he appealed to Cicero's teachings on friendship to launch a passionate attack on Aristotle's famous account of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. In particular, Aristotle's labeling of certain friendships as mere friendships of utility, implying that these people are merely valuable to us insofar as they are useful tools, and so can be discarded when we no longer have use for them. This is kind of Aristotle's kind of 3 categories of friendship, and one is sort of friendship of utility. This way of thinking about anyone is wrong, said Dr. Mehan. Instead, we should say of our barber, for instance, he's my friend, full stop. Not friend of utility, but just friend, who maybe I just don't have occasion to see very often, right? But still my friend. I like this way of thinking about human relationships. Applying it to our own relationship with Dr. Mehan, I would like to say, although of course inviting someone to be a speaker in an academic lecture series creates a professional and inevitably somewhat transactional relationship, he has become something more. He's become our friend. And although we may not have occasion to see him very often after he leaves tomorrow, the bonds of friendship will remain, and we genuinely hope he will return to visit us here at Thales College sometime in the not too distant future. The Smith Lectures on Virtue is an annual lecture series at Thales College that aims to explore different themes and facets of virtue, always with an eye towards application, applying what we've learned to our lives and to our own times in 21st century America. Dr. Mehan's talk is titled, The Second Death of Cicero.
That was a very friendly and touching introduction, Peter. Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. It was also very useful for setting me up for a discussion about Cicero. I don't claim to be a disciple of Cicero. I think you rightly guessed, admirer. I find myself in an awkward position of critiquing him very little because he is so poorly regarded in general in the academy, but also in historical circles, in political circles. And he's considered more of a kind of weak flourish, a last wispy flower of the Roman Republic, someone who is sort of a beautiful loser, who lost the Republic, and is, good at talking, but little else at the end of the day. That's his reputation today in large part. So I find myself in the position of disciple, even though I have some criticisms of Cicero. Maybe we take them up in the Q&A. I think Christianity has some things to tell him, and I think other political philosophers such as Augustine, Thomas More, and even the Founding Fathers have some things to sort of qualify and improve on Cicero, but not that much. Not that much. And while I don't normally like to come out of the box swinging at Aristotle, because in the educated, especially Thales College, Thales Academy, in this world, Aristotle is the philosopher at a minimum, but he is revered highly, as he ought to be, and I teach him very often. That said, I do think that there was a very powerful and serious discussion, a dialogue between the Greeks and the Romans in philosophy for 2,000 years until the 20th century, when Cicero did in fact die a second death. So what I want to do tonight is explain to you how he died in briefest terms, because it's actually a very kind of tedious set of threads as to what killed Cicero a second time. I want to tell you a few things about the man that you might not know, but principally, since the theme of this lecture series is virtue, I want to give you the reasons why it is a terrible tragedy that he died a second death, and why we need to, I won't use the Christian language of resurrect, let's just say resuscitate the works of Cicero again, especially if we care about the American Republic. And so yes, I come to you on a day when I have Beware Geeks bearing gifts. I have these beautiful The American Book of Fables books for A250, but in a certain sense, Cicero is a gift we need to re-gift the country for Republican self-government. And I hope to sort of make that case, at least in brief, and then hopefully have a conversation with all of you. First, that he was alive before the 20th century is something I think I need to prove, because the memory hole of Ciceronian popularity, ubiquity, and deference to him as the great moral philosopher of Western civilization is not currently agreed. And so I find myself in a certain sense in a rhetorical back foot, because most people don't even know what I'm talking about. And most people who have an education believe that they're educated. And so when you tell them a major hole in their education, which I had as well, I had to retrain myself to these things, they're a little put off by that. And so I have a kind of rhetorical hole I have to dig myself out of, but I'm going to do my best. But that's where we're at. So Cicero, savior of the Republic, stopped the Catilinarian conspiracy, Catiline, how long must you try our patience, right? Saved the Roman Senate, restored some order after the terrible disruptions of the first sort of proto-civil war of Sulla and Marius, sort of class warfare between the senatorial optimates and the populares, the populists, if you want to get really cute. But it was not a political battle, it was blood in the streets, armies, pogroms, purges, a lot of people died. Cicero, while he was, doing, speechifying, writing, becoming the most successful lawyer, speaker, and then consul, and saving Rome from a major conspiracy that almost destroyed it, he was also writing a lot of works. And from the moment of his death to the mid-20th century, his philosophical works were the most memorized, the most copied, the most studied, the most translated, the most emulated, the most revered of all of the pagan philosophical works, period. The most popular book after the Bible until the mid-20th century. Okay, now how do I know that? Well, when he did eventually die, when he was murdered, assassinated, the triumvirate, right? Octavian, who he had been a sort of advocate for in the hopes of restoring the Senate and restoring the Republic, eventually sold out with the triumvirate and agreed with Mark Antony to have Cicero killed, even though he was of the greatest reputation in all parties in Rome. He was much loved. He had given the famous Philippic speeches proving and showing Mark Antony to be a terrible tyrant, and he and his wife wanted him dead, right? Eventually, they relented. They sent a centurion out to kill him. He was out at one of his villas, heading down in a litter to a boat to make another flight from this manhunt for him. And the crows actually gave him away. People used to sort of, when the crows would call in a movie or in a story, people were like, like the death of Cicero, like the end of liberty. Like that was something we knew when the ravens were calling in the woods. It was like, that's like the end, because he was revealed by the ravens and by a faithless friend and servant, Philologos. After that moment, right before he died, he wrote the last work, the most popular and the most famous, and frankly, for our purposes tonight on virtue, the most excellent account of moral virtue ever written by a pagan philosopher. It's the greatest treatise. It's where we get the cardinal virtues. It's where we get the very beginnings of just war theory. It's where we get social justice rightly understood, not the wackadoo version that we are now suffering under in many cases today, and a host of other things, which I'll get to in a minute. He finished that work, his final work, which he sealed with his blood, and he made copies, had them copied, and then sent them in his last days to the four corners of the empire. And the people there had the good sense to make copies of that, and it was off to the races. After he was executed, right, Mark Antony demanded that his hands and his head be cut off and put and fixed above the rostrum, the speaking place, right, for the Senate in the Forum. And his wife was so mad she took her dress pins and came up to his tongue and stabbed it 100 times, because it was the tongue that wrote the Philippics against her precious husband, who, when he died, when he committed suicide in Egypt in utter defeat and disgrace, everyone quietly and quickly took down every statue and every honorific, because he was in fact a hated tyrant, Mark Antony, right? In part because Cicero had made that clear to the people. Right after that, right after his death, Augustus Caesar, Octavian Augustus, realized he had a huge problem, that he had murdered this beloved Roman. And so what did he do? He introduced Cicero's On Duties and a number of his other writings into his household and let it be known that his children were being tutored with the very man that he executed, because it was so bad for his reputation. He was so loved by Rome. And once Caesar did that, the book was off to the races and never really stopped being this ubiquitous text until, again, forgive me for just hammering, the 20th century was an honorable century, right? There was something problematic about what happened then in the second death of Cicero. It was the most copied book in the scriptoriums, Cicero's On Duties. We have all the records of monks, what they copied, and it was the most copied book, period, except for the Song of Songs, which there's we'll do that. Why that is, it's unclear. It's unclear. But it was the most copied in the scriptoriums, right? It was the second book off Gutenberg's printing press. Everybody knows Gutenberg's Bible, the first book. The second book was Cicero's On Duties. Why? Gutenberg, to announce this great new technology, wanted to show this technology can put forward the texts of our civilization. So boom, we're going to give you Cicero's On Duties. Here's our faith tradition. Here is our moral, philosophical, and social tradition. Boom. Bible, Cicero's On Duties. If you went to a seminary, like a Catholic seminary from Christendom in the high medieval through the early modern period, the statue in front of a pagan was not Aristotle or Plato. It was Cicero, maybe Seneca. The Roman philosophical tradition was considered the last full flower of Hellenism. They stood on the shoulders of giants. They have enormous debts to Plato and Aristotle, but they were considered the final word of the pagans in the fullness of time before Christ came. Right? This was the last sort of ripening of pagan thought, was the Romans. People don't think about that at all. In fact, even in the texts of translators today, they make fun of Cicero. The Loeb edition of Cicero's On Duties says he was a practical guy, not much of a philosopher, very Roman and narrow-minded, but it's a good book, right? Which is the most insulting thing you can say. And it's like even the translators, they're all basically, I wish I could do Greek, but I didn't really get the right dissertation director. Now I'm stuck with the Romans my whole life, and you can just see this sad sack whininess in their notes and in their introductions. And by the way, they make terrible flaws and errors. They trash Cicero as not very smart on this, or he misspoke about that, when in fact, if you actually understand what he's doing, they're wrong. He's actually brilliant. He's actually one of the wisest of all philosophers. Okay, fast forward, right? Fast forward. Medievals, vassalage, based on what? The oath, right? You do the hand fast and you swear the oath of vassalage. Well, where does the formula for an oath come from? It comes out of Roman law, but who taught everybody about Roman law's oath tradition? Cicero, Book 3 on Duties, right? In fact, the language of iusturandum, that's the Latin term for oaths, that Cicero describes and explains the ethic of oaths, why you should swear oaths, what they do, how they operate, and how you're burdened, how you have to keep them, right? And you have to be without any purpose of evasion, it has to be the plain meaning, all of these concepts that are in our federal law. In our Constitution itself, we have the language and formula right out of Cicero's On Duties, directly lifted, right? It's a one-for-one kind of thing. Cicero's ubiquity was so powerful during the founding period, and in fact, any period prior. It was actually considered, once you got to the Renaissance period, it was considered gauche to quote him by name. So the example, and forgive me, I know a couple of you have heard this before from me, but it's a very good example. The example that I give is, imagine if a scholar like me at a talk like this, or a politician giving a stump speech in Iowa for the primaries, or just someone trying to sell you a vacuum cleaner at your front door, and it was May 4th, and they said, "May the 4th be with you." That's from episode 4, A New Hope, minute 26, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like, if you started doing that, people would just sort of think you were an alien with this sort of strange, sort of like, like the old Hogan's Heroes, like smoking the cigarette. It's a German spy, right? Like, that's not normal because it's so ubiquitous. We know May the 4th be with you, right? We know May the Force be with you. That reference is so well known, it would be gauche of you, it would be foolish of you to give citation. That is how Cicero's On Duties and many of Cicero's works, particularly De Legibus, De Oratore, and On Friendship and On Duties, those big four, that is how it worked until the 20th century. It is in the papal encyclical tradition. They will say like, oh, as the Roman jurist says, or as the old saw says, and then they will quote, right? This is Leo XIII, right? In fact, Pope Benedict XVI was the first pope in the encyclical tradition to footnote Cicero, because he was the first one to be educated in the new reforms of the seminaries. You think of him as like the old traditionalist, but he was actually in the new mode of seminary education. The first time they didn't have Cicero as the first ethics text in Philosophy 101 in seminaries, for the first time in the history of seminaries. And so he cites him because he doesn't know him the way the prior popes did. The founding fathers. People today, Google is sort of the death of the West in some ways, because you end up sort of relying on Boolean search technology for all of your thinking, which is dangerous. It's a very useful tool. I use it all the time, but it's dangerous. There's a lot of ink spilled about Googling up or doing a Google search of all of the speeches and letters of the founding fathers to see who was talked about most. And that'll tell you who was most influential during the founding. Okay, pop quiz, what did I just say, right? You actually, if you do that, you're going to see Montesquieu, right? And then there's the Montesquieu scholars and the John Locke scholars have these huge fights all the time. No. Well, I know Montesquieu was more, but Locke was more ubiquitous in some way. Like, yeah, right. That's true, actually. But the one who is most ubiquitous is the one who comes up hardly ever. Cicero. And I've seen studies where they don't even search Tully. And you're like, oh, right? The West was on a first-name basis with Cicero. First-name basis. In the Summa of Thomas Aquinas, we see Aristotle referred to as the philosopher, right? And everyone goes, that must be the most authoritative statement. Therefore, this is the guy. Well, if you know your Cicero, which everybody did, right? By the way, just to back it up, Albert the Great, the University of Padua, University of Paris, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, all these guys, you weren't allowed theology teaching faculties in the medieval university system unless you first wrote, I kid you not, a baptism of Cicero's on duties. You had to be able to baptize it, i.e. purge it of all of its particular errors and its moral flaws and like retranslate it with grace. And if you couldn't do that, you couldn't teach, right? So that's how ubiquitous we're talking, folks. Like, it's just mind-boggling, actually, once you really get under the hood. But if you know your Cicero, you know that Aquinas uses Aristotle for some things, and he uses Tully for others. And he cites Tully quite a bit. Not quite as much as Aristotle, but it's close. They're not that far apart in terms of who gets cited more in the Summa. But if you know your Cicero, you know that the philosopher is a backhanded compliment. You also know Tully is a backhanded compliment, right? And it's like, well, how does that work? Well, it works this way, right? The philosopher is the one who basically knows the high things, metaphysics, the heavens, and the beyond, right? But they tend to sort of stand at a distance from the city. They're not practically engaged, right? And they tend to alleviate themselves from the burdens and duties of family and city, right? This is a kind of critique of philosophy, pagan philosophy, not the contemplative life as a Christian understands it, but pagan philosophy that Cicero levies, right? And so by calling him the philosopher, he's basically saying for epistemological and logical questions and for metaphysical questions, he really does know his business. But when we get to moral, political, and social matters, we should be a little concerned that there might need some purification. And there's much ink spilled on how Aquinas purified and adapted Aristotle's ethics and sort of changed things around in various ways. But Tully is how Aquinas refers to Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero. That's first name basis, almost a nickname. Tully is a signal, this is our friend. This is the one who teaches the art of friendship, the social arts of justice and community and society and charity, right? And he does talk about charity quite a bit, Cicero. And so there's actually a kind of, Aristotle is maybe a little too isolated, a little too up in the clouds, or too sort of anti-social. And Cicero is not much of a metaphysician, and it's not where his interests or his strengths lie. And so there's a kind of propertied territory. That's for Aristotle, and he gets honors there, but there's a little ding in the title. That's for Cicero, and there's honors there, but he gets dinged in his title, right? And by the way, Augustine says the same thing. This is the tradition of Christian thought about the pagans was you use Aristotle for metaphysics and for epistemology, and you use Cicero and Seneca for morals. Like that's what everybody used to say. And right now, we're going into battle, all Greek, all the time, right? And I submit to you that we're going in with our right hand tied behind our back, and it's a problem. Okay, so he did die. Hopefully, in one sense, I just QED, right? The fact that all those things I just told you, I think you would, unless you've already heard me go off before in some rambling podcast at some point, hopefully you find these things surprising. I mean, hopefully not, but it's likely you find these things surprising, right? And if you do, clearly something happened because he is not respected, he is not taught, he is not in the great books, he is not what every lettered person knows by heart, right? It's just not it's not there. So what happened? I submit to you, it was a perfect storm of things. One, Cicero's moral arguments are very powerful. They're extremely hard to argue against. And so a tactic that people like to use is to just sidestep him and almost quietly mock him without mentioning him. Machiavelli does this in The Prince, right? Those of you who know Machiavelli, he asks the famous question, whether it's better to be loved or feared. I've asked a number of Machiavelli scholars, and I mean famous Machiavelli scholars, and they're only like dimly aware, usually because I asked the question in another meeting earlier, that Cicero is the first to raise that question and build an entire argument about it in On Duties. He raises the question whether it's better to be loved or feared. Machiavelli says it'd be better, right, to be both. But if you have to pick one, you should pick fear, right? Now, Cicero says something different. He says, obviously it's better to be loved, right? Much better. And you should never seek to be hated, because to be feared, because to be feared is to be hated. And hate is the destruction of civil society. Hate is the destruction of the community. It's the destruction of justice. It's the destruction of everything that undergirds civilization, right? That's his teaching. But people think that Machiavelli is this genius for raising this question and having this dialogue. But really he's just saying, Cicero, not you. It's opposite day. And Machiavelli becomes a little less amazing when you realize he's kind of doing Cicero's On Duties opposite day over and over again with a number of his tropes. And no one knows the counter arguments, right? They actually don't understand the dangers Machiavelli is leading people into. And they go, yeah, means ends, I know he's kind of bad, but he's really good on X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, there are some things you can learn from Machiavelli, but oh my goodness, the dialogue between he and Cicero was immense. Voltaire does the same thing. In the Candide, right, the sort of proto-French revolutionary document, he has Pococurante, this Italian Renaissance man senator of northern Italy, pull a Cicero volume out and go like, yeah, I didn't really read Cicero much, because when I heard that he was basically skeptical, he's an academic, meaning he technically thinks that nothing can be really known, it's only probable arguments, right? When I heard that, I figured, well, if he doesn't believe it, why should I? So I didn't study him. And he laughs it off. The entire Ciceronian corpus is mocked out of Voltaire's Candide. Adam Smith, he writes all kinds of word-for-word translations of Cicero's On Duties, and then he just drops the last sentence because he doesn't like the conclusion that Cicero is about to engage, and so he cuts it off, right? So there's this sort of silent mocking, this sort of silent erasure. Smith's not mocking him, but he's just erasing and editing, but silently. But you could say, well, that was deceitful. Well, I think for Machiavelli, it's certainly deceitful. For Voltaire, it's certainly deceitful. For Smith, again, he's just doing what people did. Everybody knew he was editing On Duties. Everybody knew he was coming after him. And I'm going to fix this book. This book's wrong, right? I'm going to try to, take a swing at the king, right? And people understood that. That was understood. So there was this kind of primed condition for mental erasure, because people wanted to swim past him, people didn't want to argue him, and those who were arguing with or against had a custom of not mentioning his name very often at all, right? That's one. That's a condition. Two, the strong account of moral duty that is in Cicero. I mean, we've been talking about Cicero's On Duties. It is the fundamental theory of moral duty in the West, right? You could imagine that anyone who wanted to basically pry people off of their primary duties to family, country, church, community, and wanted to make some new configuration of society, some radical new ideal, that you would really need to sort of pry people away from the basic natural duty arguments. And so you would definitely not want those to be ubiquitous, because you want to turn the people into the Play-Doh for your new, novel arrangement. So I think that's another reason why Cicero's On Duties, particularly in Cicero and his duty-bound scenario, was lots of bad actors wanted him erased. You can keep the Greeks. Plato is complicated, it's dialogic, it's inconclusive. I think a good reader and a thoughtful, seminar and a good community of letters can certainly tease out fundamental or immutable principles out of Plato for sure. But it's a lot harder. It doesn't commit the will. It doesn't sort of lay out clearly, here's how the virtues work, etc. It doesn't do that work quite so clearly. And so it was kind of, you were allowed to do that. And then I also think it's not, Cicero's On Duties and his works are rhetorical philosophy. They are meant to both enlighten philosophically, but also move you like a rhetor, right? It's rhetorical philosophy. So it's calling you to do something. So it actually operates, it operationalizes, it brings things forward into practical life. Whereas Aristotle, this is the idea, here it is. And obviously, if you fall in love with Nicomachean Ethics and you read it a lot and you talk about it, it will form you and it has incredible power. I mean, over Cicero, for goodness sake. Like, it's a great work, but it's not quick. It doesn't quickly engage the heart. It actually is for the elite. It's complex, it's intertissued, it's layered, it's dialogic. It's a tough work, right? And it doesn't quickly move people to start on the road to virtue. And so, yes, the ivory tower can keep those more complicated, less easy to sort of operationalize, but we got to get rid of these Romans because they're way too powerful on persuasive of committing the will. And I think that was another reason. And a third reason, Cicero's rhetorical philosophy has a philosophy of rhetoric in it. De Oratore, or On the Ideal Orator, I recommend the Bill May translation if you're interested. It's one of the greatest works in Republican political philosophy ever. It is the paideia, i.e., it is basically an image of how do a free people educate themselves and maintain free government. And it rests powerfully on what is rhetoric in relation to a res publica, right? And I won't get into all of it here, at least not yet, not now. But what it teaches is that it convicts the will of the intelligent person that they actually have to become excellent at speaking to their fellow man such that they can be eloquent. That is to say, ex loquor. And I'll get into a fight with the linguists, but I'm right if you go through a very long argument. Ex logos, get the reason out into the ears and hearts of others, i.e. you spread and propagate the logos. Not for you, the philosopher only, not for your small cadre, but you find the way to share the immaterial things, the res, to the publica. That you have a res publica because people have private property, physical things, house, couch, computer, right, dog, cat. You've got property, but you also have shared immaterial property, res publica, and that requires rhetoric, and that requires a deep and profound understanding of the soul, of the body, of the ear, of poetry, of meter, of the subtle nature of communication and how one moves the heart. You don't want that philosopher teaching things about virtue and natural law and the normal traditional duties of morals. He's the windpipe of the entire West. You have to crush that larynx so that it can't speak anymore, right? Because I want to do something new with the West. And every wild-eyed, utopian, crazy, program of, Frankfurt School, Marxism, Foucaultian postmodernism, socialism, whatever ism you want, you got to get rid of that monster. Cicero's like a 800-pound gorilla just standing in the middle of the tradition, and he's very dangerous for your program, right? And it's much better to have complex, private, difficult dialogues of Plato and treatises of Aristotle than this very powerful, civically engaged and rhetorically adept moral philosophy. Add to that, so all these things stacking up, one more, World War II. God bless the GI Bill, I'm a fan, but doggone it, Wheelock is my last felon, and he's an innocent dupe in all this. You guys know Wheelock's Latin? Anybody ever take a Wheelock's Latin class? Yeah, I did too. Wheelock was looking at all these soldiers coming back from the World Wars, right? Well, from World War II, and was looking ahead to what are we going to do? How are we going to, educate them? And they've got this golden ticket of the GI Bill, right? They can pay to go to school. Well, let's teach them the classics, which is that's very good. But what he decided was, instead of doing what we always did, which is teach them right? Some basic Latin through Martial, right? Martial's epigrams and Aesop's fables. And then teach them Cicero's speeches, and then teach them Cicero's philosophy and Seneca's epistles, right? Instead of that normal progress, and yes, there's a little Ovid, there's some other things, but that's the central cursus honorum through the classics. And then the Aeneid, finally, and Horace and Catullus, which are much more complicated, and Plautus and others. Instead of that, he said, I think I want to try to relate to the soldier and talk about things that the soldiers care about, right? So instead of doing Cicero, the great orator, master of the arts of peace, master of republican self-government, right, master of rhetoric, literally the expounder of humanitas, of humane treatment of one another, the humanities. That whole conceptual world comes out of Cicero's writings. Okay, and I haven't even gotten into the work. I'm getting nervous on time. Peter, you have to give me a 5-minute mark. But the last thing I'll just say about this is he instead swapped Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, right? Gallia, right? Can anyone do it? Yeah, exactly. That's what I learned. That's how I learned, right? Gaul is divided into 3 parts. And the vocabulary was the gladius, right? The testudo, right? Like learn the military stuff, which is all fine. And that was actually, sometimes there was a course, Caesar was popped in there, right? Here and there. But it basically effectively pushed Cicero out in favor of a kind of Veterans Affairs version of the classics. But Caesar, it turns out, is a sociopathic murderer who sold millions of Gauls into sexual slavery. Pardon me, children. I don't think there's, whatever. It's a family place. But and murdered his fellow Romans for glory. And then foolishly miscalculated his relationships of fear with the Senate and became hated, and then got stabby in the back, as we all know, et tu, Brute, right? In Julius Caesar's, in the play that Shakespeare wrote of Julius Caesar, right, there is a line where a character comes in on stage and says, Cicero is dead, right? The Roman Republic is over because his work is the representation of self-government, of liberty, of republicanism, friendship, rhetoric, persuasion. And Caesar is the jackboot, force, fear, power, might over right, et cetera, right? And now I see on the internet people doing Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, Alexander the Great memes all the time. And they think Cicero is a loser, right? Things have changed. Now, Peter, how much time do I have? 20? Oh, phenomenal. Okay. What I'd like to do is give you a sort of quick tour of some of the treasures that are in On Duties. I've alluded to a few of them, but I actually want to try to explain some of the moral genius of this work, not just sort of as a bank shot implied by everyone else who took it seriously, but I'd just like to speak to the thing itself for a minute. On Duties is 3 books, and it is structured very simply this way. The first book is on virtue, except he doesn't call it virtue. He calls it honestum, the honorable. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, but that's very important. And you learn to attend to Cicero's great moral genius, that it doesn't matter that you have the name and the definition. It actually matters that you find the right ways to define and talk about it, because moral life is an active condition, which he learned from Aristotle, right? But that means that active condition needs to be moving, and so you have to have a kind of wit to see how a virtue appears in motion. And the way you talk about it, right? If it's not the right way to talk about it, it actually starts to warp your impressions. If you just have a single account, it's just virtue or it's just excellence, right? He says, no, it's the honorable. Why? We'll get to it in a minute. Book 2, the useful, utile, honestum et utile, right? What is expedient, we often say. What is useful, right? Or as I like to say, those 2 books are sort of the mafia don, right? He says, good for you, right? Sort of like the threat, right? This is good to do in itself. This is the right thing to do according to our nature. This is just good in itself, but it's also very useful. And then book 3, he basically cements the argument, makes the case, and then takes up every counter argument of any strength that, in fact, the good and the useful are always one and the same. And any time you think that you found something useful that's not good, or something good that's completely inutile, not useful to you, you've actually mistaken the natural law. You're not thinking. In fact, he says anybody who thinks that the morally good and the useful are not one, or anyone who says that or teaches that, is teaching the most pernicious doctrine, the teaching that will destroy civilization. Right? He says that's the origin of every assassin's dagger, every poisoned cup, we might add, sort of every manipulated algorithm or stolen identity, right? That's where all moral evil comes out of, right? It's like, this would be good for me, but it's not good. It's like, that never happens. And in fact, if you think you've calculated to that effect, you're wrong, and you need to go recalculate, right? It's a bold claim. Today, especially, people are shocked. No. Obviously, there's good things that are not very useful. It's like, are there? And by the way, if you start thinking this way, look out. You become like a casuistic ninja. Like, it is unstoppable, because so many things people are like, well, what about the case of, and people come up with all kinds of cases, and then you just, no, bing, 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 and they're destroyed. Like, once you learn how to argue this way, both from utility and from nature, from goodness, and then you find the act that links both of those things up together, that's called prudence. That's literally the training in prudence, right? So that's the book in general. Why does he call it the honorable? We forget what's not in the Greeks. We forget what's not in Greek philosophy. They don't have a theory of moral duty. They don't talk about it. They don't explain it. They say this would be right, this would be natural, and this would be beautiful. All true. But what about you got to do it? It's your duty. Right? That's Cicero. That's where that theory of moral duty, right? And by the way, people are so ignorant now that when you say, look, you need to do your duty. I've had people tell me, like, don't talk about duty. That's Kantian. I'm like, have you read a book before Immanuel Kant? Like, people talked about duty before that, right? Like, yes, there are evil theories of duty that are ridiculous, but that's our theory of duty. What about scandal? The moral theory of scandal, like you give scandal. Christ talks about it, right? Don't scandalize the little ones, right? Where does that moral theory get expounded? Most people would say the Christians, following Christ's words, they try to tease this out. That's true, they did. They were using Cicero because Cicero has a teaching on scandal. Well, why is scandal so important? Well, it's because it turns out man isn't alone. Man is social, man is communal, and therefore every virtue has to be thought of not simply as the virtue, but the virtue as it's perceived. Therefore, the honorable. You have to do your duty in an honorable way, because honor is actually one of the most precious and important properties of mankind. Which of course we know, right? When someone, so we have laws against slander and detraction, like you're not allowed to do that. You can't just destroy a man's reputation, because they need that, right? It's a beautiful thing. Maybe a line from Othello is coming to mind. My honor, right? Sort of my reputation, right? It's important. Why? Well, let's take it from the position of Book 1, Onestum. Why is honor important? Because if you are going to help other people and they think you're a cad or an idiot or a loser or a drunk, right? Or mean to your kids, whatever thing you gave a false impression, then guess what they're not going to do? Trust you. And if people don't trust you, you can't help them. So if people don't trust you, you can't be of service to them, and you can't do the fullness of duty in your city. So if you don't care how you look, you don't care. Now you could say, well, but if you could give into honor and be a hypocrite and a Pharisee and et cetera, it's like, yeah. There's risks to every good thing. Like, there's ways of abusing it. But of course, it's obvious that you have to be honorable to keep faith. Which, by the way, another teaching. He says fides is the ground of all justice in the city. Fides, right? That's an additional teaching on top of the Greeks, which is to say, your word is your bond. What you say is what you do, and what you do is what you say. And that is the anchor, because that's how all commerce, that's how all friendship, that is how every kind of occasion, be it marital bonds, be it schools, be it contracts in business, be it swearing an oath for high office, you name it, it's bona fides. That word comes out of Cicero's On Duties. Do you have good faith? What are your bona fides? He goes so far as to say that if you do not care about your reputation, if you don't care about being honorable, that you lack all moral integrity. You're actually morally depraved. You're a sick puppy and need help, right? Powerful, kind of startling in a way. But we're like, well, no, but aren't we supposed to sort of just declare our truth and let the chips fall where they may? Facts don't care about your feelings, etc. Like, isn't that, we just got to say it? He would say, do you? Or do you need to do your best? And while we're all imperfect, and maybe we do just blurt it out because that's as good as we can do because we weren't properly prepared or we didn't foster enough virtue, but if you give up on the fact that I bet there was a more friendly and thoughtful way to put that would have been more effective, more eloquent, that would have been more attractive to more people, such that they would then imitate you, and now you have more virtue rather than you taking care of yourself and your excellence, arete, virtus. No, honestum, shared virtue, exchanged, radiated. You see how much more prudent that attempt at teaching the virtuous life is? It's extremely effective. This is one little aspect of what he teaches. Let's take another, very much related to this. In his discussion of temperance, right, Machiavelli has new modes and orders, right? I'm going to teach you new modes and orders, right? That's the famous promise, right? And he's like, yeah, you have to sometimes be a beast. You have to be ugly, right? And be either a lion or a fox. And the lion and the fox, Machiavelli says, the fox is when you're sneaky and fraudulent, right? You're sort of the betrayer, the little Machiavel, right? Richard III. But you also sometimes need to be the lion. That is to say, you need to menace and be tyrannical and scare, force, kill, right? Do the hard, ugly thing. Sort of Jack Bauer on crack, right? Sort of like, it's for national security. Like, but you're shooting a small girl's leg. You know, it's like, I need her car. You know, like, what? Like those sort of strange Machiavellian false premises of morals, right? Where doing something evil is useful, right? And the scriptwriters go to great lengths to try to make that happen, right? Well, that all is, again, opposite day from Book 1 at the end of Book 1 of On Duties, where Cicero says there's only one mode for man. It's the rational mode. You have to have right reason for everything you do. And anything else slips into the mode of the beast, either the lion, you use force and fear and violence, or the fox, you break faith through fraud. Those are your two options. You can either hide in plain sight and scare everybody off the ball, or you can trick them, right? Those are literally the two errors that break faith. One, you break faith and the bonds by saying, hey, I want you to be afraid of me or dead, and the bonds are broken that way, and therefore I hate you because I fear you. Or I'm going to just basically break the bonds by tricking you and defrauding you somehow, and then either you don't figure it out, but you are now removed because you're sort of the sneaky, guilty party, and so you don't have affection anymore. Think of, the thief is always worried about being robbed, right? The demoralization of the guilty conscience, right? And once they figure it out, fides is destroyed. They don't trust you for anything. Once bitten, twice shy, right? In that, he says, basically, you have to understand that the proper rational mode is one that is modest, moderate, right? That is, the mode of all temperance, he says, is moderation. Which you're like, okay, I knew that from Aristotle. It's like, yeah, you did. But what he adds to it is, he then combines that understanding of modesty and temperance, temperantia, together. And then the entire section on that virtue isn't just about temperance or about hitting the mean. It's about art, it's about aesthetics, it's about poetry, it's about stage acting. And it's about having that sort of French, sort of chef's kiss, perfect understanding of how to hit the mark, right? And why, this is why, by the way, this is why the humanities, why we said we're going to teach more poetry. Like, we're going to actually make sure that people learn to sing. The humanitas that got built up in the Renaissance, the humanities that were sort of a much fuller understanding of the arts as part of the liberal arts, as opposed to just logic, grammar, rhetoric, etc., the trivium and quadrivium, and the law. Why that was added was because of Cicero's On Duties, which is to say, if you really want to hit the mark, you actually do have to have a kind of sense of what is most beautifully human. What is the beautiful act? And this is here, he's basically, what he's doing is, it's applied Aristotle. What does Aristotle say in the Nicomachean Ethics? Aristotle says that everybody chooses a good deed because they see a beautiful image of themselves in an ultimate particular. You see yourself leading your cavalry brigade in the charge through the rising sun, right? And you know now is the moment, and once you see that beautiful image of you being courageous, being timely, being effective, you say, that's the moment, this is it. I see the image, it's beautiful, now I go. That's how people, by the way, we all do that. You get up in the morning because you have an image of yourself being organized, and you might have a counter ugly image of you sort of still with like lick, spittle, drool, right? Hitting the snooze button a third time and being angry at yourself later on in the mirror when you brush your teeth late for work or carpool or whatever, right? It's a beautiful image that drives you on, and sometimes a counter image that helps as well. Chiaroscuro, tragedy and comedy, right? The poets know their business, right? Well, so Cicero basically says, how do I teach temperance and moderation and modesty and a humane mode for all my deeds? Well, we need to actually teach aesthetics. We need to teach beauty, because the beautiful deed requires a certain kind of humane taste. And he's like, obviously taste is different than moral judgment. But he says they're almost only theoretically separate, right? Which is why a beautiful soul, this is why we want people to have music. And if they can't play an instrument, at least music appreciation, right? If you don't have the money for piano lessons, at least you want your kids to listen to Bach on Sunday, right? These are the kinds of arguments that, frankly, we know in some ways because Cicero's echo effect is still bouncing around through our tradition. But as we forget, as civilization is like butter over a hot skillet and we are running out of butter, right? Where do you go to replenish, right? Where is the straight cream? Cicero's On Duties, Cicero's On Friendship, Cicero's De Orteri, those are the texts that shaped us and shaped our sense of self-government, of liberty, conscience. I wanted to learn about conscience. I was like, where do I go to find conscience in the tradition? You guessed it. Cicero. Free will? Where's the concept of the will? Where does that come out of? Cicero and Seneca. Yes, there's the part that turns. Aristotle talks about it. Everyone's talking about some kind of third part of the soul, the spirited. But those are hazy accounts that are not nearly as developed. And it seems to me, free will for a free people, we ought to know a lot about that, right? Cicero and Seneca, the Romans. So the second death of Cicero, I think, has been a tragedy for the West in so many ways. And I hope that in this little sort of tirade that you're convinced that he needs a third life. So thank you very much. Mm-hmm.